Welcome to On the Middle East, our Monitor's weekly podcast on the big stories unfolding across the region. Today we'll be talking about the Kurds, who are among the world's biggest nation without a state of their own. Yet we're seeing them play an ever bigger role in regional affairs. In Iraq, the Kurds played a major role in uniting the opposition and helping to overthrow Saddam Hussein. In Syria, they were at the vanguard of the US-led coalition's fight against the Islamic State. But the Kurds often find themselves cast aside when the big powers feel it's in their interest to do so. This pattern has been repeated particularly in the United States' relations with its fellow NATO member, Turkey, which is home to the largest number of Kurds in the world. The Kurdish people continue to face political and cultural oppression inside Turkey as much of the world looks away. And today, as Finland and Sweden seek to join NATO, Turkey is demanding they crack down on Kurdish groups which Ankara labels terrorists as a condition for not vetoing their admission. With us here today to discuss all these issues is Giran Ozcan, a Kurd from Turkey who just founded the Kurdish Peace Institute in Washington. Welcome, dear Giran. It's great to have you on our podcast today.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
So, Giran, you've just set up something called the Kurdish Peace Institute in Washington, D.C. Can you tell us a bit about the Institute and, what's it all about? What are its aims?
Right, okay. Well, I think I need to kind of go in a tiny little bit in history before I go into what exactly Kurdish Peace Institute will try to do, because the conflict created by the division of the Kurdish people between four nation states is arguably the central conflict of the modern Middle East today, just because of the sheer amount of people that it impacts across four nation states that I would say are pretty significant and very important to regional stability and increasingly to international relations across the globe, and especially this new or rejuvenated concept that we are starting to talk about again, especially in places like DC, great power competition. And I think the region that the Kurds live in, and which they call Kurdistan, will be a very important region going forward. And when we're talking about nation states like Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, these are nation states that are very key to well, firstly, regional stability, as I said, but now increasingly, like we saw in the news most recently, even Sweden and Finland's NATO accession is hinging on Turkey's approach, and that hinges on its Kurdish issue. So that's why I needed to kind of go into a little bit of the history of the issue to explain why we needed this kind of a platform in a place like Washington, D.C. And so while, the Kurdish Peace Institute will primarily focus on exactly what its name suggests, a peaceful and political solution to the Kurdish question, it inevitably and inherently entails the democratization of the nation states that I just mentioned, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, which in itself is by no means a small feat. I've been in DC now for almost 5 years. My previous role was the representative of the People's Democratic Party, HDP, the second largest opposition party in Turkey. And the last few years in DC has definitely taught me that this country, and actually a lot of countries outside of the region, don't really know what the Kurdish question is, haven't had direct engagement with the Kurdish people and their issues in each specific context. So I think as the Kurdish Peace Institute, we wanted to be able to offer and provide policymakers and decision makers in places like Washington, D.C., a more direct engagement with the Kurdish people, the political and military actors, and what their aspirations and objectives are.
Well, can I just jump in? Right. Because you said, Kurdish Peace Institute, and that your primary goal is to sort of find ways to get to peace and create a discussion, I guess, among policymakers where we can get to peace. But when you say peace, where are you talking about exactly, Giran? Because you mentioned your background with the HDP. Is it fair to say that your institute will be more focused on the Kurds of Turkey than the other countries that host Kurds?
A direct response to the last sentence would be no, because the Kurds are either fighting or are being killed in all four of the nation states that I just mentioned. Yes, Turkey has the biggest Kurdish population, and maybe the best known Kurdish conflict is the one between the PKK and the Turkish state. But unfortunately, the Kurds are being oppressed, suppressed, and killed in all four of these countries. So I repeat my answer, no, we won't be solely concentrating on Kurdish affairs in Turkey, as our advisory board and our researchers and non-resident fellows will show everyone. We want a context for all four parts of Kurdistan, by which I mean the Kurdish populations and the Kurdish regions that fall within the national borders of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria.
Well, isn't your beef, though, with Washington, certainly with the successive administrations, is that they fail to take up the Kurds as a standalone sort of issue, and that they tend to approach respective Kurds, be they Iraqi or Syrian or Iranian or Turkish, through the lens of the country that hosts them. And so is this something that you're going to try and sort of reverse, for example?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, we are a non-profit in the United States, and our mission states that we're here to educate people in this country, because until now, the United States has simply not been equipped to recognize the importance of this conflict, or the proposals even that Kurdish political actors have put forward to address it. And as you rightly say, American perspectives on Kurdish aspirations are often inadvertently derivative of the nationalist and or sectarian viewpoints of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And I think we believe that this puts the United States at a disadvantage, and all too often has actually made the US complicit in real humanitarian and security disasters. So while it's disadvantaging itself, if we look at it through the American perspective, it's also leading to these nation states just having an open check in any which way that they want to suppress, oppress, and kill their Kurdish citizens.
But surely you don't include Iraq in that list. I think we're a bit beyond that in Iraq now today.
I mean, we might be. Kurds are still being killed in Iraq. Yes, not so much by Baghdad as previously was the case. Kurds in Iraq are being killed by airstrikes from Turkey, cross-border bombardments, and operations inside Iraqi borders. Only just a few years ago, and still today, ISIS is still active in Iraq and still killing Kurds there too, among other people. So I'd say yes, in Iraq, the context has changed. The Kurdish regional government is a status that the Kurds have simply not attained in any other place. But that doesn't mean that the Kurdish issue is solved in Iraq. And as I said, the Kurds in Iraq, whether as a result of their own mismanagement, their own mistakes, or the actions of the states that suppress and oppress the Kurdish population, it's still far from being resolved, far from being an accepted end result for Kurds to be pleased with. I mean, they still have a lot of problems.
You say the Kurds, but there are huge divisions among the Kurds. Wouldn't you agree? I mean,
yes, absolutely. And there are huge.
When you say that Kurds are being killed in Iraq, some Kurds would say, yes, they're being killed in Iraq with the help of the Kurds in Iraq. So, when you say the Kurdish question, I think it's a bit confusing, because what do we mean exactly by that?
Well,
These are all sort of, especially to people who aren't necessarily in the know.
I mean, I, for one, will never complain about the political pluralism in Kurdish politics. I mean, I've lived in the US for almost 5 years now, and I know what political polarization means. I've seen it firsthand. And I would say that political plurality, different voices, different parties, different agendas, even, is actually healthy for the Kurdish people. And I'm not one of those that fetishizes Kurdish unity or some sort of homogenous political agenda for the Kurdish people. So yes, there are different political parties struggling for different ends, different political objectives, even on, wildly opposing parts of the political spectrum. There are leftist movements, there are conservative, rightist movements amongst the Kurds, but I don't see that detrimental. I do, however, think that some Kurdish political organizations are criticized for cooperating with states that have it in for the Kurds, if you like. And that is being criticized by a large base of the Kurds. But I would definitely not see that as a negative development.
Well, speaking about Kurdish organizations, there's one in particular that I want to talk about with you, the PKK, which is designated as a foreign terrorist organization by the United States. And of course, there are more Kurds living in Turkey than there are anywhere else in the world, correct? And one could say that at least, I mean, it's hard to really have precise figures, but one could judge on the basis of the support to some extent that the HDP, the party we're representing, on the amount of votes they get in elections, and the fact that, a fair many of the lawmakers in that party do seem to support PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan's views. I mean, how do you square this designation and yet being in Washington and trying to sort of help people understand what's at stake here and why they should care about the Kurdish issue and about peace between Turkey and its Kurds? What are the arguments that you make when you speak to administration officials?
So you're right, the PKK is a proscribed organization, and even the story of how it was proscribed is interesting. I mean, I don't think, I'm definitely not the naive young person that I used to be. And I know that prescriptions, especially when it comes to these kind of engagements, the US prescribed the PKK towards the latter part of the 90s. That's a lot of haggling, that's a lot of bargaining between two nation states. And even now, we see this once again with Sweden and Finland trying to apply for NATO membership, and Turkey again using that as some sort of leverage to gain its political objectives, to make other countries acquiesce and accept its kind of conceptual framework around the Kurdish issue. So yes, it is difficult trying to explain, especially here in Washington, DC, that policymakers need to engage with this issue much more directly, not take the statements and political objectives of the nation states that seem unwilling or unable to solve their Kurdish issue at face value. Because in a time where great power competition is once again shaping the calculations of policymakers, in which every square inch on the map is part of the global chessboard, the Kurds and Kurdistan have become important pieces of the game. And not only due to their place on the map. Some have even argued that Turkey's purchase of the Russian S-400 missile defense system, which has severely strained relations with the US, can be traced back to its Kurdish predicament. And if this is true, and we believe it is, then a deeper understanding of...
What do you mean by that? Can you explain that to us? What do you mean?
Well, I mean, now that, the US is directly engaging with Kurdish political and military actors on the ground in both Iraq and in Syria. And this, we can trace this back all the way to 2014, when ISIS attacked cities like Kobani, like Sinjar in Iraq. In Sinjar's case, the PKK fighters themselves came straight down, and in which no other actor would defend or were willing to go to Sinjar and defend the Yazidis from genocide. The PKK did. Now, we can say that the PKK did this for its own interests, or, that would be laughable, because you'd have to be able to say that the PKK somehow manufactured ISIS's attack against the Yazidis in Sinjar, which is just silly to say. But at the end of the day, no one else was willing to stay there and defend the Yazidis, and the PKK did. Now, that was one engagement that the international community had to face, were faced with in 2014, but also in the city of Kobani, when ISIS attacked, and when all standing armies were running out the way. Again, Kurdish fighters who are impacted and influenced by the ideology and the vision that the PKK and Abdullah Öcalan, specifically the leader of the PKK, who have articulated over decades. Kurds that are aligned with that vision stood and fought against ISIS and ultimately pushed it back. And so the US had to engage with the Kurds on the ground, because defeating ISIS was an objective and a priority for the whole world. And
yet the United States today is fully on board with Turkish operations against the PKK in Iraq, while at the same time advocating that the PKK should remove itself from Syria, or at least that's the sort of subtext of those unity talks that were happening between the Kurdish parties inside Syria. So, isn't there an element of sort of contradiction and hypocrisy in the US policy, if there is indeed such a policy?
Well, I would say even more disappointing is that it's not hypocrisy, it's not a contradiction, it's actually ignorance. And that's why I think that the Kurdish Peace Institute is ideally situated to combat that ignorance. Because what we want to do is explain, especially to policymakers here, that they don't have to accept Turkey's security conceptualization of the Kurdish issue. Cemil Bayık, probably seen as the de facto leader of the PKK right now, had an article published here in the US, in the Washington Post, in which he calls for reconciliation. He says that the movement itself is ready to sit down with Turkey and solve this issue once and for all. Abdullah Öcalan, from inside his solitary confinement in İmralı Island, has said for years that he is willing to sit down and solve this problem, even saying that he could do it, or they could do it. If the PKK and the Turkish state were able to sit down, this problem could be solved within a week. Now, when things like these are on the table, it would be silly for a country like the US, who has now engaged with the Kurds, who now is partnered with the Kurds in fighting against a very inhumane organization, to try and get these two major actors in the region, and I see the Kurds as major actors in the region too, but to try and get Turkey and its own Kurdish population and its own Kurdish rebellious population to sit down and solve this issue once and for all. Because it all comes down to this, how do we convince the rulers of Turkey that truly accepting the existence of the Kurdish people will not only not eradicate Turkey from the face of the map, but will enhance its resilience and contribute to its prosperous future. That's something that I think is both in the Kurdish interest and the US interest.
I've noticed on Twitter that there are some sort of veiled sort of, let's say, accusations that somehow through you, the PKK is, that there's an attempt to legitimize the PKK. How would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, I think any Kurd from Turkey will tell you that that's a very popular tactic used by the Turkish state. And it's quite unfortunate and a little sad to see that people who you follow and you see, and, these are generally intelligent people who have, come to a position in which they have to defend a Turkish state tactic, or even actually profess themselves an age-old Turkish tactic that would deem any kind of dissent, and not just Kurdish dissent as well right now, as some sort of PKK propaganda. Osman Kavala is a great example. He is neither ethnically Kurdish or has never even organically engaged with the Kurdish movement, and yet the poor guy, I'm sorry to say, he's been in prison for almost 5 years and just got sentenced to life. So in a country where someone like Osman Kavala can be deemed or labeled a PKK terrorist, then, it's just sad to see generally intelligent people using the same tactics as this authoritarian Turkish state is. And I'd like to just say that the First Amendment in this country is, one of the most progressive pieces of legislation in any constitution in the world. And I mean, I would even go as this far. We, as the Kurdish Peace Institute, want to educate people about the Kurds and Kurdistan. The PKK is a major actor in this region and arguably has at least half the Kurds supporting this organization. Now, that is a mandate comparable to any legitimate government in the West today. So I think we just need to talk about these issues. The First Amendment allows us to talk about these issues, allows us to highlight what these organizations are saying, what the objectives are. And, I think a hurdle that we're trying to overcome is the ignorance that states like Turkey bank on here in DC. And I am very hopeful that we will fulfill that mission.
Well, just one more thing. Can you tell our audience how you're funded?
Well, we are a nonprofit here in the US, and we will be totally funded by contributions by people in the US. We won't be taking any foreign government money ever, because, I think what we want to do is in the interests of both, yes, the Kurds in Kurdistan, but also Americans. I think the American people, the American government need to see that understanding Kurdish political objectives, understanding the Kurdish people and their aspirations will benefit their decision-making process. And I think, the Kurdish issue, even someone like Joel Rayburn in an interview only a couple of months back said that this is an issue that significantly impacts the stability in the region, and a more stable Middle East is in everyone's interests. And I think that a lot of people here in the US would like to contribute to a platform and an institute that will educate policymakers here in DC in engaging with the region in a much more sustainable and peaceful way.
Well, Joel Rayburn, by the way, is a former Trump administration official who covered the Syria file. And so does this mean also that you'll be looking to work with fellow Kurdish organizations like the KRG representatives office there, the Yazidi advocacy groups? Will we be seeing an attempt to sort of create bridges?
Absolutely. I mean, we are first and foremost a research institute, and our produce, what we produce, the kind of knowledge we produce is open for everyone to use, because, as I said, the fundamental issue regarding the Kurdish question, especially in Western capitals, is ignorance. And that's why that's what we want to allay, and that's what we want to get rid of. And I think openness to all Kurdish political actors in Kurdistan and in the diaspora is a fundamental thing that we will be open to, and both in our research and what we produce, we hope to be accessible to everyone.
So, final question: if someone wants to publish, let's say, a paper that's critical of Abdullah Öcalan and the PKK, you would be open to that?
Yes, absolutely.
As long as it's, well-reasoned and inoffensive. I mean, not,
We will fact check everything. We will have editorial guidelines. But you are someone that really knows the Kurdish movement very well, and criticism and self-criticism, especially for the PKK, is one of its fundamental columns that it bases itself on. So if the movement itself is open to that, it would be a shame for a research institute like us to not be open to it. And we will stringently apply our editorial guidelines and fact-checking processes to everything that we will receive.
Well, we'll be following with great interest. Thank you so much, Giran, for taking the time. I know you're extremely busy with this institute now. So look forward to reading all your stuff, and gelek spas.
Thank you very much, spas bash.
I'm Elizabeth Hagedorn, and I'm the State Department correspondent at Al Monitor.
And I'm Joe Snell. I'm Al Monitor's video editor. Let's admit it, this past year has been difficult to stay on top of the news and sift through what's accurate and what's misleading. Let Al Monitor help you.
If you care about the Middle East and North Africa, you should consider listening to Al Monitor's audio series On the Middle East with Andrew Parasalidi and Amber Zaman, and On Israel with Ben Caspi. You can now watch our newest video podcast, Reading the Middle East with Gilles Capel. You can subscribe to these series on your favorite podcast platforms.
And through a host of free daily and weekly newsletters, we offer a range of perspectives with the highest journalistic standards. You can subscribe to these newsletters at almonitor.com.
As an award-winning media service headquartered in Washington, D.C., Al Monitor has a network of over 160 contributors around the world.
So if you haven't done so already, be sure to visit almonitor.com, where you can find all of these newsletters and podcasts, along with first-class reporting and analysis.
And that brings us to the end of today's program. I hope you too will follow the work of Giran and the Kurdish Peace Institute, and also tune in to next week's podcast on the Middle East. Thank you.